remote jungles of India's Lost Delta. From all over the world they are flocking here, following a strange story of a mysterious temple and gifts from the gods. The story begins 1 year ago. World-famous archaeologist Indiana Jones follows a tattered map to an ancient edifice. Could this be the fabled Temple of the Forbidden Eye? According to Jones, the temple contains a chamber of destiny, where an ancient idol lured visitors with promises of gifts, eternal youth, earthly riches, or visions of the future. But any who looked into the eyes of this double-dealing deity took a detour to doom. A chilling tale indeed, but not chilling enough to cool off the hot pursuit of thousands of greedy globetrotters. They're ready for a supernatural shopping spree. It's an interesting story. It really is. Apparently interesting enough even to justify spending over $100 million just to bring it to life. But the question is, how did it come about in the first place? Hi, I'm Bram, Disneylander, as it were. If you've been following this channel for any amount of time, you know that I am completely unreasonably obsessed with the Indiana Jones adventure in Disneyland. Obsessed to the point where Mara takes up permanent residence on my right arm. Don't look, by the way, close your eyes. The Temple of the Forbidden Eye is the e-ticket attraction of e-ticket attractions. Even now, 26 years after opening day, it remains the greatest, the pinnacle of Disney Imagineering, in my less than humble opinion. And so with 4 episodes over the course of the next month, I'm going to be bringing you the depths of my obsession and insanity to you. We're going to be going over the secrets and history of pretty much everything that there is to know about the Indiana Jones adventure in Disneyland. And so without further ado, I am pleased to present to you episode 1 of The Forbidden Eye.
This is a map to the Temple of Mara, the legendary Temple of the Forbidden Eye. There's no way it's nearly as cool as it looks here. That's if it even exists at all. But come on, there's something I need to steal in this temple, or respectfully repurpose for a museum. Let's go.
Thank you, real-life Indiana Jones, for that great acting, that great introduction. Really, just really good stuff. Unfortunately for you, though, it's going to take quite a bit of searching before we can actually find Mara's temple. You see, the Indiana Jones Adventure Ride opened in Disneyland in March of 1995, but of course it didn't pop up overnight. So we're gonna rewind the clock a little bit. Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first Indiana Jones movie, debuted in 1981. But that's not even the beginning of our tale, so we're gonna rewind it even more than that to set the stage for this ride. To begin our adventure properly, we need to go all the way back to the 1930s and 40s, where a middle-aged Walt Disney is finding the first pieces of his inspiration for what would become Disneyland. Walt visited various World's Fairs in his lifetime, at least 5 different World Fairs he visited, and he was notably inspired by the fusion of technology and education and entertainment coming together as one. Walt also visited several amusement parks in his time, and though he enjoyed them, it seems he found them to be lacking. He liked the idea of an amusement park, but found them unsavory as a whole, and admittedly, amusement parks at the time were not what they are today, and so Walt hatched the idea to make an amusement park of his own. He wanted to fuse the best aspects of amusement parks and the World's Fairs that he visited to make something that was better than either of them on their own. He envisioned something that wasn't just for kids, wasn't just for adults, but was for everyone of every age to enjoy. So the story goes. That's a fairly crude summary of the inner workings of the mind of a man that none of us really knew.
but it'll serve just fine as our starting point. At first, Walt planned a small park next to his animation studio in Burbank, California, and he was very serious about it. It wasn't just some idea that he had tumbling around in his mind. He was making plans for this park to be there. It was a 16-acre space of land, and just about every detail of it was thought out and planned. But of course, Walt's ambitions quickly outgrew the size of the property, and resistance from the city of Burbank led Walt to purchase 160 acres of land in Anaheim in 1953. In July of 1954, things were moving quite fast. Ground broke on Disneyland, which was followed by this frantic year of often 24/7 construction to get the park built and ready for opening day in July of 1955. They built the initial version of Disneyland in a year. Now they take over a year just to do a refurbishment. Like, it is crazy to think of how hard those Imagineers worked back in 1955. I'm going to stop right there, however, because this video is not to be a complete history of Disneyland. That's not what you clicked on. But what matters is that against all odds, Disneyland was built. It would have been very easy for the park never to have been built, or for the park to have failed shortly after having been built, but it didn't. And so now, for the purposes of our story, let's narrow in on the history of Adventureland in particular, one of the opening day areas of Disneyland, and what is now home to the Indiana Jones Adventure. In the late 1940s, Walt Disney Productions began to put out a series of 14 short documentaries titled True Life Adventures. And these documentaries were, by all means, revolutionary. They were the first such films to capture footage of animals in the wild. It showcased these animals in their natural habitats all across the globe. And that's the foundation of Disney's interest in this concept of adventure. It started with more of an animal and nature-centered approach. And so the documentary series was the inspiration initially for Adventureland, which was originally envisioned as True Life Adventureland, with less of a focus on the exotic jungle atmosphere that we have today. True Life Adventureland was imagined as something more similar to what the Animal Kingdom is in Disney World now. That is a park with real-life animals and authentically recreated habitats. Of course, real-life animals never ended up in the area, but Walt's original idea to recreate the feel of an exotic and tropical and far-off region still holds true in Adventureland today. On the creation of the land, Walt Disney is quoted as saying, "We pictured ourselves far from civilization in the remote jungles of Asia and Africa," and I'd say that remains a pretty excellent summary of what Adventureland is now. When Adventureland opened, however, this concept of adventure was vague and unspecified. All the trees were young and sparse, and there wasn't a specific cohesive feel to the land as a whole. But with the addition of the Indiana Jones Adventure in 1995, the land was brought together in a much more cohesive way. All of Adventureland, Jungle Cruise in particular, was altered to fit within the framework of the Indiana Jones ride's storyline. It takes place in 1935, and so all of Adventureland has this 1930s feel to it. And somehow the feel of adventure feels all the more adventurous. It's probably just because I've been to Disneyland so much, but adventure feels more adventurous when accompanied by 1930s swing music and 1930s rustic explorers decor. And so yes, Adventureland is still largely founded upon Walt's original picturing of it, but the Temple of the Forbidden Eye tightened up the vibe of the land as a whole. But wow, we are already managing to get ahead of ourselves, so let's pull back in time once more to the 1980s and actually take a detour to another area in Disneyland so that we can get a better understanding of how the Indiana Jones Adventure came about in the first place. Any guesses what land it is? It's not Fantasyland. For the record, it's not Frontierland. It sure as heck isn't Main Street. It is Tomorrowland. In an effort to bring more teenagers and young adults to the park, to Disneyland that is, former Disney CEO Michael Eisner approached George Lucas with a partnership opportunity, which is very important. If you gotta understand the context of this here, because Disney was, at this point, for the first time ever, reaching outside of Disney's own properties and ideas for the park. Nothing like this had happened before, and it really set the stage. As you can imagine, this was a game changer for Disney. Of course, in the future, Disney would just go on to buy all the properties that they wanted in their park. But still, in the 80s, this was a big deal. George Lucas was excited about Tomorrowland in particular, and he thought he had ideas to make the land better. You see, he liked the idea of Tomorrowland, but didn't much care for Tomorrowland itself, which sounds honestly a little too familiar to how I feel today, so I'm sorry, George, you didn't change it that much. But that's another topic for another time. The collaboration between Disney and Lucasfilms led to a couple attractions. It led to Captain EO, a show starring Michael Jackson that opened in 1986, and it led to Star Tours, of course, which opened in 1987. Star Tours was the first non-Disney property ride to open in the park, and it was extremely well received. This was one of Michael Eisner's gambits that ended up paying off big time. Its success opened the door to another partnership with George Lucas just a few years later, and that partnership was, of course, the Indiana Jones adventure. Well, actually, the George Lucas partnership was more of an ongoing relationship. The Indiana Jones Stunt Spectacular live show debuted at what was then Disney's MGM Studios in Florida in 1989, and the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril roller coaster opened at what was then Euro Disney in Paris in 1993. But we'll be talking about those attractions in depth a couple weeks from now, so just hold your horses. We gotta stay on topic or I'll wander way too far away. Our focus for today will remain on Disneyland California, where it could be argued that the Temple of the Forbidden Eye saved Disneyland in a way. I doubt the parks would have closed down without it, but Disney parks were in a bad place in the early 1990s. The animation studios were finally on a rebound after a long string of movie flops following the death of Walt Disney, but in April of 1992, Disney made a bold move. They opened a brand new park, a brand new Disneyland in Paris. Well, just outside of Paris, in France is what matters. It was called Euro Disney when it opened, and to put it shortly, everyone hated it. This is one of Disney's biggest blunders. The park was a flop, largely due to bad marketing, bad timing too. There was a recession that just hit in Europe, and most importantly, the simple fact that the people of France didn't want it there. Disney saw that a lot of European visitors were coming over to Disneyland, so they thought they could plop a park in Europe, and they didn't want it. Disney took a massive loss on Euro Disney, and while it has become a much more beloved park today, its initial failure spelt disaster for Disney, which should have otherwise been on an upward trend. There was a lot of potential for a lot of new things to come to all Disney parks, a lot of new things to come to the Disney animation studios, but Euro Disney's failure led to cutbacks, even in our own Disneyland. For example, California Adventure never should have existed. It could have been, would have been, the spectacular Westcott, but it was never built, which I'm totally not angry about at all. I am not at all salty about the greatest Disney park of all time never having been built and receiving a California Adventure instead, but that is yet another topic for yet another day. On top of the unexpected financial loss from Euro Disney, Disney's president and second in command, Frank Wells, died tragically and unexpectedly in 1994. And when Michael Eisner decided to take on Frank Wells' responsibility for himself, rather than promoting the expecting Disney's third in command, Jeffrey Katzenberg, there was an explosion of drama and bad press. Katzenberg left the company ultimately, and the bad press continued on. And then on top of this storm of bad media, there was the Northridge earthquake in 1994, which was a 6.7 magnitude quake in Los Angeles County, which shocked theme park visitors to an extent. It reportedly took Disneyland's attendance down by 10%, this earthquake alone. All of this is to say, Disney and the Disney parks, Disneyland included, were in a tight spot in the early 1990s, and the success of Disneyland for the coming years was largely dependent on the success of the Indiana Jones Adventure ride. When is he gonna start talking about Indiana Jones? I've been watching forever. Right now, actually. Hi guys, it's finally time to talk about the Indiana Jones Adventure. There's a reason I split this video into a 4-part series. More specifically, however, we're going to turn our attention to Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition. If you've never heard of this particular attraction, it's probably because it doesn't exist, or at least it was never built. You see, Disney starts the process of developing something new for their parks by setting the Imagineers loose to do something known as blue sky Imagineering. During this creative phase, Imagineers are encouraged to ignore issues with potential costs, to ignore issues with technology limitations, and to sometimes even ignore the laws of physics. Imagineers come up with some of their best ideas during this time when they are able to just set reality aside from their imagination and go to work. In the late 1980s, Imagineers set out to blue sky ideas for an Indiana Jones themed expansion to Adventureland. And the concept art and things I'm about to show you here, they're often regarded as a lost Disney attraction or as what Indiana Jones was supposed to be. But keep in mind, this was a creative process. If there was unlimited funding and resources, yeah, maybe Indiana Jones would have been what I'm about to show you, but there wasn't really an expectation that any of this would come into existence. It was kind of just a brainstorming phase. During this Imagineering phase, however, Imagineers developed plans for Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition, which would have been a massive area expansion onto Adventureland. It still would have been Adventureland, but it would have been like a sub-area within Adventureland, in which a giant dilapidated temple complex would have been built and constructed along the banks of the Jungle Cruise, and inside of this river temple would have been 4 separate attractions all converging into one space. The first ride was to be a Jeep attraction, quote unquote, which essentially would have been what the Indiana Jones Adventure ride is today. That is a dark ride on a Jeep, which would have taken you through temple scenes inspired by the Indiana Jones movies, such as the giant rolling boulder at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The concepts for this seem to translate pretty closely to what we actually ended up with today. The second ride was to be an ore car attraction, which would have been a mine train roller coaster inspired by the minecart scenes from the Temple of Doom movie. This attraction would have shared some of the same show spaces as the Jeep attraction, which I think is an awesome idea. If we're looking at this concept art, it's a really cool concept that Disney has never really come back to have 2 e-ticket attractions share some of the same show spaces. I think that really tightens up the theming. If Star Wars Land had done this, it would have made you feel, I don't know, just more immersed the whole time to see multiple things happening in the same lore and in the same space. The roller coaster, however, was an idea that was reused. As usual, Disney likes to recycle unused ideas, and a significantly less cool, admittedly, version of an Indiana Jones minecart roller coaster opened, as I mentioned, in Euro Disney in 1993, during a period when the Indiana Jones addition to Disneyland was on pause, which is something that we'll come back to in just a minute here. The third ride to share this showroom would have been a rerouted section of the Jungle Cruise, which would have passed by the river temples and into a shrine before floating on into the massive showroom where you could glimpse the ore car ride and maybe even the Jeep attraction. Another ride in this same $100 billion trillion space. I think that was actually the estimated figures for the Lost Expedition, $100 billion trillion dollars. Fourth and finally, the Disneyland Railroad would have also been rerouted straight into the main showroom as well for yet another glimpse at this would have been revolutionary feat of Imagineering. Like I said, all of this blue sky Imagineering was done in the late 1980s, and I'm guessing that Michael Eisner took a look at their proposed ideas, and Disney's bank account had a heart attack, and so Michael Eisner turned and greenlit Splash Mountain instead, which would have been cheaper, both due to it being smaller in scale than the Lost Expedition, but also cheaper because they could reuse a lot of the old animatronics from the defunct America Sings show. On top of that, Disney really needed a get wet water ride, so it was a wise choice ultimately for Disney to go ahead with Splash Mountain before Indiana Jones. So a few years later, when it was finally time to revisit the Indiana Jones addition into Adventureland, Disney was in that awkward, stressful, financially difficult period of the early 90s that we already talked about, and so a lot of the grand ideas of the Lost Expedition were consolidated into the Indiana Jones adventure, the Temple of the Forbidden Eye, and all things considered, it's pretty impressive how incredible the ride ended up being, given the struggling state of Disney at the point, for Disney to build the Indiana Jones Adventure, which I can't wait to talk detailedly about in future videos, but also to retheme the Jungle Cruise and retheme other sections of Adventureland. It was a pretty massive overhaul that we did end up getting, and so I don't know what this is. Anyways, let's continue on. In 1993, Tony Baxter, a legendary Imagineer, responsible for the original Star Tours, responsible for Big Thunder Mountain, Splash Mountain, and more, led a team of 400 Imagineers in the development and construction of the Temple of the Forbidden Eye. Once final plans were conceptualized and settled, ground broke on the construction of the attraction in August of 1993. But that's where we're going to stop for today. We managed to spend all the length of this video and just got to groundbreaking and construction. But I'm excited. I'll be back next week. Next week in part 2 of the Forbidden Eye, we will turn our attention to the construction of the ride, the finalized story of the ride, and the ludicrous advertising campaign for this ride. They spent a fifth of the amount of money that they spent on building the attraction just to advertise it. And there's some weird, insane stuff. It's a very bizarre, over-the-top advertising campaign. I'm very excited to talk about it. Until next week, however, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe, share this video with a friend that you think might be interested. It's people like you, people who are viewing this, that make this kind of content possible. I know this is different than normal Disneylander stuff, this kind of deep dive into history. It's taken a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of passion. And so if you could share it around, it would really mean the world to me. I appreciate it so much. This has been so much fun. I am so excited for next week. I still can't end a video even when it's a special mini-series. Bye. A quick shout out to some of the amazing people that have helped make this project possible. Josh Bell, thank you for the bootleg Indiana Jones theme in the intro there. The C, a wonderful member of our Disneylander Discord server, thank you for the digital image enhancing. A link to his YouTube channel is below. Adela, thank you for the live action map prop. And Aurora, thank you for filming the lovely live action indie sequences and for all the encouragement and ideas. Bye for now, everyone. See you next week for episode 2.